Today is Monday, 21st of July, 2025. My name is Maria Luisa Ornelas-June, and I'm interviewing Dr. Arturo Madrid as part of the oral history project of the Macondo Writers Workshop. We're on the campus of Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, and it is the summer gathering of the Macondo Writers Workshop. Thank you, Dr. Madrid, for agreeing to the interview. This interview is being recorded, and the unedited copy will be housed in the Nettie Benson Library Archives and Special Collections at the University of Texas in Austin. Please know that if there is anything you do not wish to discuss, I will honor your wishes. Also, if you need to stop to use the facilities, please let us know. If there are topics you wish to discuss and I haven't asked about it, please do bring them up.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's start with you growing up. Can you tell me about your childhood and your family?
Yes, I grew up in a very small community in northern New Mexico, almost to the Colorado border. My father was a school teacher and a school principal. My mother was an appointed and elected public official. The town I grew up with, Tierra Maria, was the county seat of a very large county, Rio Arriba County, which is as big as the state of Connecticut plus. And we were surrounded by rivers and forests and sagebrush. And it was a rather idyllic childhood because I had the run of the community. Everybody knew me. I knew everybody. That was both a plus and a minus, of course. Grew up going fishing in summers, sledding and hunting during the winter. School was, my father worked there. He was the principal. I had the run of the school. And my mother was an elected and appointed official at the courthouse. So I had the run of the courthouse as well.
What did she do there?
She was elected. She was appointed deputy county assessor when she was about 20 years old. A couple of years later, she was elected to that position. Then she served as county clerk as well. She was appointed county treasurer at some point or another, and she served also as county manager. The only offices she didn't hold were county sheriff, she could have done that easily, or county superintendent, which she also could have done easily.
Did you have any siblings?
I had two siblings, younger than me. My brother Ibanez, who's passed away, and my sister Concha del Mar Madrid, who is a professional pianist.
Do you have any stories growing up that you especially recall?
Oh, yes. I think the most important stories, of course, are those having to do with my relationship with my grandparents. My grandparents had a farm, some 65 miles to the south, much warmer climate. They had products wouldn't grow at 7,500 feet elevation, which is where Tierra Maria was. I would accompany my grandfather when he came up to sell his produce. And we went to all the little communities surrounding the county seat, and he had his clientele, and they would come out to purchase apples and other fruits and dried products and chili. Particularly green chili was the most important crop he had that they wanted. And I got to know the communities as a consequence of that. Lovely to get to know your neighbors and where they live. And of course, my schoolmates also lived in these communities, so I would get a chance to greet them as well. The other one was, of course, having to do with fishing and hunting. My brother was an avid fly fisherman, and so we were out any chance that we had. We were out on the river fishing away. One of the most interesting stories I can tell, and I told it in my family memoir, In the Country of Empty Crosses. We were a Protestant family in a Catholic world. And so my Catholic classmates were trying to make sense of that, at least some of them. My neighbor Dora, as we walked to school, would say to me, Arturo, where are you going to be buried when you die? because you can't be buried in the Camposanto, Casa Camposanto. So I, at some point or another, having talked about it with my parents, and said, well, where are you going to be buried? Well, probably in the Camposanto of my parents in Las Truchas, or my father, Camposanto of my parents in Las Vegas. But I said, well, I grew up here. I like it perfectly fine. And you could just bury me out in the sagebrush. I'll be perfectly fine out there.
So it was, you found a way to fit in even when you were a little different.
Yes, because essentially my parents had standing. They were professionals in this community. They were highly respected. Everybody knew them by virtue of their professions, and they made it a point to be present. Particularly at weddings, you had to be invited. But at funerals and wakes, everybody went. So they were very present in there. And whenever there were any public events, or at school or at the courthouse, we were highly present there. So I had the run of the institutions and the run of the community. And I had my schoolmates, younger and older. And so I was part of that world, an integral part of that world.
So what was the role of education, reading, and writing in your family?
Well, I come from a multi-generational family of educators and educated persons. My grandfather is the first one in our family to have post-secondary education, because he went off to do a program of study to become an evangelist at a college. So he completed a program of study to be an evangelist. So he was literate in both Spanish and English. And of course that passed on to my father, who not only got a Bachelor of Arts degree at a university, but also got a master's degree. On my mother's side, my mother also had at least a couple of years of college. One of her sisters became a nurse. Another sister became an educator, as was her brother, who became not only an educator, but an educational administrator. So that ran in the family.
Where did your parents go to college?
There was a university located in my father's hometown, Las Vegas, New Mexico Highlands University. And both of them attended that institution, as did my sister. They graduated.
So tell me about your educational background, where you went to school.
Yes. I did 11 of my 12 years, actually 13, because there was something called pre-first, not called kindergarten, because we were in a war with Germany. So we eschewed kindergarten, so it was called pre-first. So my 13 years of education, 12 were in the Tierra Maria Public School. And then my senior year, my parents sent me out to a Presbyterian boarding school in Albuquerque, the Manal School. And I completed my high school education there. Then I attended the University of New Mexico while living at the Manal School and working at the Manal School. I completed my Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish, although I could have done comparative literature and history as well, triple major. Didn't have that in those days, but I did have enough credits essentially to qualify, and went off to graduate school at UCLA under the National Defense and Education Act Fellowship.
What is that program?
The National Defense and Education Act was created as part of the Cold War. The realization that education was going to be very important with respect to developing the kind of community that would be able to compete internationally. And so the United States government underwrote a major program to develop people who were going to have scientific and engineering backgrounds, but who also had area studies, who were knowledgeable Africa, about Latin America, about Southeast Asia, about Europe. so that they would be prepared for a long-range struggle with the Soviet Union. And one of those fields was Latin America and Spanish. And so I went off to UCLA with a very generous fellowship that permitted to me to pursue PhD studies in Spanish and Latin American literature.
So when you went to graduate school, did you go through a master's program and then a PhD, or did you just...
No, it was a PhD program. I got a master's along the way, but it was very incidental.
Mm-hmm. And what jobs did you go on to do after you graduated?
My first job, I completed my program of study, and dissertation was pending. And I went off to teach at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Very unusual because there were many, many jobs in California, and my peers preferred to stay in California because there's an opportunity. Folks that had come from other states, say the Midwest, etc., returned to the Midwest or to the South, but most of us stayed in California. I was the exception. I went off to New England to teach at an Ivy League college, a very unusual experience. And it was unusual terms for the college as well because they did not hire from California. They hired from other Ivy League institutions, or failing that, from the Midwest, from the Big Ten institutions. So I was very unusual in that regard.
Can you tell me what it was like to go from studying in the western part of the United States to entering East Coast schools?
Dartmouth College was an elite institution. It was a very old institution. And it had a student body that was essentially the sons of the sons of the sons of Dartmouth graduates. But there also, it was a moment when colleges and universities were becoming aware of the necessity of addressing a larger population. So there was a small contingent of African American students, and there was a small contingent of Native American students, because Dartmouth had been originally founded as a school for American Indians. And I was the only person essentially of color at that institution at that moment. So I was an unofficial advisor and mentee to my African American students that I came in contact with, as well as to the Native American students. But I was also part of that larger world because it was a small college in a small town, and you were integrated into the college, not so much into the town, but into the college. So you're part of that world. And your world didn't go much beyond the college because there was entertainment, there were the arts, we had dinner with each other, we knew each other, and if anything came into town, we were there.
What did being at Dartmouth add to your worldview coming out of New Mexico as an Hispano?
It was a major in terms of my credentials, my bona fides. It was very unusual for people in my generation to have that experience, and particularly for somebody of my background to have those credentials. It has served me enormously well over the years. Had I gotten a PhD at Berkeley, that would have been my bona fides right there. UCLA at that point was not a first-class research institution. It was in second tier. But Dartmouth had cachet. And so as a consequence of that, the 5 years I spent at Dartmouth, it gave me considerable cachet.
Your work in sort of bringing the Hispano and Mexican-American experience into the academic sphere is tremendous. What is that what you expected to do when you went into school, to college? What were your expectations? Were they met, or did the road take you somewhere else?
My models were my professors, one of my professors at the University of New Mexico was, in fact, from my hometown. He was a very distinguished professor and writer. So my idea was I would go get a PhD and come back and teach at the University of New Mexico. And I would be teaching young people like myself from the multiple villages of northern New Mexico, and that would be my life. But that got transformed when I come to UCLA because I come in contact with a larger Spanish-speaking world. I had colleagues, fellow students who were from Spain, from Mexico, from Colombia and Argentina, from Chile. And so my world expanded in that regard. But I also had peers who were like me, Mexican-American, and who came from California, from Arizona, from New Mexico, even from Texas in those days, and were doing the same thing I was doing. They had not had the advantages I had had, but they were seeking to improve their situation. And they did not come from families that had that kind of lineage of higher education or multiple, or essentially literate in two languages and who knew that larger world. I had that advantage. But what I gained there was a sense of a larger Spanish-speaking world and larger kind of space in which I could work. That was expanded significantly at Dartmouth College because when I got to Dartmouth College, all kinds of programs that came out of the Great Society programs of President Johnson were in play. Students were being recruited to come and visit colleges during the summer. High school students would familiarize themselves with colleges and universities, and students were being recruited to study at these elite institutions as well. And so I got a sense of what their possibilities were. Meanwhile, some of my peers, some of my college peers were already immersed in that in the Southwest. I'd been touched a little bit by it because while I was at UCLA, I pursued a program of study in teaching English as a second language. And it dawned on the creators of these programs at UCLA that there was a population in the United States that could benefit from that kind of instruction, Native Americans as well as Mexican Americans. So I had a sense that there was a world out there in which I could operate, that I could serve. And that was certainly made evident and patent to me when I was at Dartmouth College. So by the time I returned to California in 1970 to become a founding member of the Third College, also known as the Third World College, the Lumumba Zapata College, which was created to serve Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans, I was thrust into that milieu, which I had been preparing myself for the previous 10 years.
Where does your work intersect with writing and the literary landscape?
It became very, very clear almost immediately because as we searched for materials to instruct our students, there were few and far between. And we realized that we had to create our own library, shall we say, our own fund of knowledge and research. And so my generation became involved in creating research centers. The one at UCLA is a prime example, but there was one at the University of Texas as well. We created publishing houses, Aslan, and journals at UCLA, Aslan publications, so that we would have a place where we could publish what we were learning about. I began to develop a series of essays having to do with the experience of Mexican Americans or Chicanos, a set of texts that drew on the existing literary materials that we had, the few novels that we had, but we had lots of poetry. and we had theater as well, and we had lots and lots of folklore that we could draw on, and I started writing about that. And there was a place that I could publish Aslan publications, but there was also bilingual review class that was starting about that same time. And we had some models of professors that had written about those things as well. The late Luis Leal at the University of Illinois, who subsequently comes to University of California in Santa Barbara, but also my paisano from New Mexico, Sabino Livarri, who wrote poetry and wrote prose, short stories and like about these. And there were numerous others who were doing that. So we had some models that we could pursue. And some of us, of course, decided we wanted to write a great Chicano novel. And it never got there, but they started. But we did write short stories, and we did write poetry. And our dear belated late Octavio Romano had created a couple of journals that you could publish your poetry and your short story in as well. El Grito, for example, and El Espejo. So there was a flourishing opportunity because finally we had created a talent pool that could begin to produce materials to be used.
It sounds like you're touching on literary activism. How do you define literary activism?
Our initial entry into that was essentially to record our experiences, the experiences of our families. That's where it started. And much of it had to do, many of the people that got involved with it were Tejanos, and they wrote about being migrant workers. New Mexicans were not much about migrant workers. Instead, they wrote about the traditions and the stories of the peoples of New Mexico. Arizonans likewise wrote about their experience of being Sonorenses and their traditions there. Californians eschewed the myth of the Californio, the creation of this peoples who were silver dawns and had ranches, etc. And this wrote about the experience of working the fields of California, but also, and importantly so, their experience as an urban population.
When did you first become aware that your writing could be that form of literary activism?
Very early on, because before I even set it down in publishable form, before I even got published, I was invited to speak at not only scholarly meetings, but also gatherings. At gatherings where I would be asked to speak about the literary creations of my generation of my peers. So I would recite and perform poetry and talk about these creations. And these were of great interest. I remember one of great significance was an event held in 1974 on the campus of Stanford University, titled Sexto Sol, not the Quinto Sol, but the Sexto Sol. It was a gathering of artists and writers at Stanford, one of the major gatherings, which led subsequently, I believe, or was companion to the gatherings that were occurring in Southern California, Floricanto gatherings, where writers and poets would gather and perform their materials, and these were collected. And so we had a burgeoning tradition in that regard. We had a combination of scholars who were beginning to study these manifestations, but also we had these people doing it live, and some crossed over.
How old were you?
At that point, I was in my early 30s. I would have been 31 or 32.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that this was at the beginning of your writing career?
This was coincidental with my writing career. I'd been writing previous to that, but my work had been more of a scholarly type, and I was looking at this expression and tying them together. And it was not so much, say, going to historic sources and bringing them to bear, but instead taking up what current writers are doing and connecting them to their historical sources.
Now, writing, both academically and artistically, has that helped you define your identity, or was it the other way, that your identity defined your writing?
It was the other way. I think my identity defined my writing ultimately. The most important thing is I connected with other people like myself who had concerns about the status of Mexicans in U.S. society. In my case, I was very attuned to what was happening with African Americans. And of course, by virtue of the fact that I grew up in a place where there were multiple communities of American Indians, very sensitive to the circumstance situation of Americans. And when I spent time in Minnesota, subsequently connected to the American Indian movement as well. But there in California, having returned after being away for 5 years, and after having spent 5 years studying in California, I was connected to people of my generation who had also pursued higher education studies leading to a degree, or who had gone into higher education to run programs that brought more Mexican American young people to school, or who were beginning to expand our institutional space beyond the university and beyond the educational system and into the cultural world, who were beginning to create little spaces where they could perform. We were beginning to see we had the beginnings of the muralist movement occurring while I was doing this as well. So there was an eruption of artistic expression from music to art, and literature was at the center of it.
How did this movement shape your identity and your writing?
Well, it's certainly, New Mexico was a bit narrow with respect to identity. It disdained the Native American root, and it disdained the Mexican mestizo root. It preferred to see itself in terms of a Spanish colony, where Spanish culture, the Spanish language, Spanish traditions were dominant, and essentially erased or denied that we were indigenous, not only with a North American community, but also indigenous by virtue of the mestizaje that had taken place in New York. So in California, I began to realize we're part of a much larger world. And our history is really not only North American, but it's connected to the other North America, which was Mexico. And then to the larger Latin American world, quite apart from the Spanish world. Now, my field of study was Spanish literature, Spanish Renaissance literature, and Spanish Renaissance and Golden Age poetry. But there was a connection. There was a connection, and I began to see the connection.
How did the Hispano community in New Mexico receive this evolution in your thinking about your Hispanidad as a New Mexican?
I came to that late because once I left New Mexico, I really didn't return to New Mexico except for visits to friends. But I was highly aware of the fact that there were movements in New Mexico, both at the University of New Mexico and at the New Mexico State University and at New Mexico Highlands University, where both my mother, my father, and my sister had studied, that were seeking to make connections between our Hispano experience and the larger Mexicano and Spanish experience. And they were founding journals, and they were developing organizations, and they were establishing centers, and they were promoting a larger connection with a larger world. And some of my peers were doing that even as I was working in a much larger environment. They were doing it at home.
Tell me about navigating your career at this particular point in time when you have these synergies between Californios and the Hispanos and the larger Latin American community.
It was a very complex kind of situation because my return to California was to immerse myself in a Chicano world and in the Chicano movement, which I had been separated from. The Chicano movement had been developing between 1965 and 1970 when I was at Dartmouth College. I was connected to it slightly by virtue of the fact that my then wife and I were involved with the United Farm Worker movement in the upper part of New England. And I was connected to what was happening in New Mexico because the land grant movement led by Reyes Lopez Tijerina had its base in Tierra Maria, which was my hometown. So I was very aware of that part of the movement as well. And I certainly was aware of what was happening in California with respect to the Plan de Santa Barbara, the development of a university-based movement to create Chicano studies, because my colleagues and peers at UCLA and other University of California campuses were central to it. I was also aware of the literary developments because some of my friends and colleagues were writing and producing and performing. So I was being educated even as I was following a very traditional academic track that had to do with Spain and Spanish literature. I was being informed by what's happening on the ground. And when I come to join the faculty, the founding faculty of the third college at the University of California, San Diego, I had to immerse myself totally in that world because that was what we were going to teach. And so I had to retool myself to do that. So rather than somebody who was going to be focusing on Spanish poetry of the Renaissance, I had to become knowledgeable about Latin American literature and about Puerto Rican literature and about Cuban literature and about the creations that had to do with Mexico. So I became in the process a jack of all trades, literary and historical.
I have a question of something I don't understand that I was unaware of. You mentioned a land grant movement in Tierra Amarilla. What was that?
Yes. New Mexico was settled as part of a land grant system utilized by the King of Spain. He would make a grant of land to people who would develop it. And that's how northern Mexico developed, and that's how certainly much of Mexico developed. And essentially the King of Spain took ownership over the lands that his explorers founded or determined. And New Mexico was settled initially by a grant to a man by the name of Juan de Oñate, who was a scion of a family of miners who had made a fortune and used his fortune to go and explore the possibility of an even greater fortune in what is now part of the United States, in New Mexico. And there were a series of land grants over the course of the subsequent 3 centuries, 1600s, 1700s, into the 1800s, which when the United States takes over that part of the world. And there were individual land grants, but there were also communal land grants. The communal land grants were more common. And there were communities that would move and to take possession of these lands and develop them. Well, when the United States takes over, they essentially abolish or restrict these land grants. And there is a legal fight that takes place through the U.S. judicial system to retain those, to have them recognized. The indigenous people, the American Indian population, were successful, for the most part, in reclaiming their lands. Not all of them, but in New Mexico, significantly so. Those who were not successful were less successful, were reservations, but they were indigenous property. The individual land grants were successfully litigated because there were very wealthy people that were able to claim them and say, it's not from that hill to that river, but they surveyed them and they were able to say, we have marked them, we know them. We're able to successfully litigate them in many cases, not in all cases. The communal land grants were much more difficult to litigate because the paperwork was not as substantive. It was more old, and it depended on an old system of land tenure, and the markers were not as clear. So when the U.S. takes over, they federalize that land and turn it into forests. So we have extraordinary forests throughout the West that are, or some of them were part of the land grant. And the understanding was that people would be able to graze their crop, graze their cattle in those land grants, that they were able to use the lumber and the wood, etc., and they were able to take the water from those. But that was, over the course of time, denied to them. So the land grant movement is a movement trying to gain some of those rights that had been lost. And this Baptist evangelical preacher who comes out of Texas and is able successfully to revive that movement to land grants and to get the people together, and that created a movement, a very powerful movement in New Mexico.
Thank you. When you talk about your career, it sounds like you were really trotting a new path. There wasn't something established. You said that you're following a career in a very traditional way, but there's all these new movements going around that changes the trajectory of the career. Did you have a mentor?
I had multiple mentors. But I'm going to go back to the initial part of your question. I was informed by, of course, multiple movements. The civil rights movement is going on at the moment. I had occasion to see and hear Martin Luther King speak at UCLA, so that was a momentous event. I was able to see what the Great Society was doing with respect to beginning to open paths for minority populations to enter the institutions of the society. I was deeply connected with the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, to an extent that would not have been the case also. Anyway, you had a question about my trajectory.
And your
I'll push a
mentors.
little trajectory a little bit. I had a very unusual trajectory. I'm not going to say it's a unique trajectory because I suspect there were other people like me had a similar trajectory. Not a lot of people, but that trajectory, of course, took me to the East Coast, to an Ivy League institution, to a small place where you could engage a number of things. I was very much informed by the civil rights movement already because that had been part of my life at UCLA. But to be part of the Great Society initiatives at Dartmouth College was also new. And Dartmouth College became a center of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And so my then wife and I were involved in that. It was also, there was a dimension of it that had to do with challenging the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson. And my then wife and I were part of that as well. We organized in New Hampshire electorally and challenged LBJ. And as a consequence of that challenge, LBJ decides to resign and not pursue a re-election. So those things were formative. But I was also aware of what was going on in the Southwest, the land grant movement in New Mexico, the Chicano blowouts and the schools, the educational movement, the Plan de Santa Barbara organizing the university curriculum around Chicano studies. And of course, we were connected to the farm worker movement, even as far as New Hampshire, we were engaged in that. So when I returned back to California, I know about these things. They're not foreign to me. They're already, but I'm thrust into it in such a way that I have to be able to take them all in and say, okay, this is part of my reality. And not only take them all in, but be prepared to teach about them and to speak about them.
Did you have mentors that helped you through this?
Yes, I did. Probably my most important mentor was a professor of Spanish, a very distinguished scholar, Carlos Blanco Aguinaga, who brought me to University of California, San Diego, to the third college. And he, though he was a Spanish, was very politically involved already with the Chicano movement and in solidarity with it. And he was very connected to the African American community, very connected to the Native American community, and he'd been a leader in the creation of this third world college that was designed not only to educate African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans, but also to bring in faculty that was Native American, African American, and Mexican American, and staff. And so that was a learning experience too, because you had to be sensitive and aware of the other populations as well. So he was a very important mentor to me. I had other, shall we say, colleagues who served as mentors. They were my age as well, but they were doing things that I was not doing. One of my dear friends, Juan Gomez Quinones, was founding the first Chicano research center in the country, and was founding the first journal, scholarly journal there. Other colleagues and friends were founding literary journals as well. I became engaged at a different level at that point because I was trying to figure out, okay, what is my role going to be with respect to my scholarship? And I was not any more interested in spending time in a library. I wanted my scholarship to speak to the needs of the immediate community. I was not interested in connecting with my peers. I was interested in connecting with the community and with my students.
Which is a great entree to my next question.
Okay.
Did you mentor people in these areas?
I would like to think that I did. And I suspect that any number of folks would say you were my mentor. That principally happened at the University of California, San Diego, because I was able to recruit graduate students who subsequently became major scholars and figures in that world. And I was able to also teach young people who then became significant players, not only in the academic world, but in the larger institutional world. And they would say that I was their mentor. I never cultivated that. I do not have a community that say, oh, this was my student, etc. I preferred, they were my friends and my colleagues, and they were my fellow workers in this world.
I'm going to segue now into Macondo because you've been a part of this community for a while. When did you move to San Antonio?
I came to San Antonio in 1993, and my connection with Macondo has a backstory. The backstory is I was the director, the founding president of an Institute for Policy Studies. We've skipped over part of my trajectory, but we'll bring it up to date. I was at Claremont, California, which were the seat of the Tomas Rivera Center, the Institute for Policy Study on Latino Issues. And around me were 6 colleges that make up the Claremont colleges. And one of the colleges invited Sandra Cisneros to come and do a reading of her work. And I knew Sandra Cisneros' work already. We had not met formally, but I knew about her work. So I went to her reading, and I asked her a question which I had asked other of my writer friends. Why are we not being published by the major presses in the United States? And of course, it was not a question she could easily respond to, but it was a question that was in all of our minds. A few years later, not more than 2 or 3 years later, I come to San Antonio, and one of our first connections in San Antonio, I had already had a footprint in San Antonio because we had an office at the Tomas Rivera Center here at Trinity University in San Antonio. And I was known to the policy people in the city already. I had strong relations with them. Some members of the San Antonio community were on my board. And so I had a footprint there. I knew the people. My spouse did not. But one of the first people that we run into is the director of the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center within the first week that we were there. And it was a connection having to do with Yale. She and my sons had been students at Yale, and I had met her there. And so we became very connected right away with the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. And at some point during the year, that first year that we were there, I get a call in the middle of the evening and says, Arturo, this is Sandra Cisneros calling. Oh, how are you, Sandra? I met Sandra, not friends. Arturo, I'm calling you because we're putting together a program at the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, and I'm calling to ask if you and Antonia could support it financially. I said, of course we will. Of course we will. And that was when we connected with Sandra for the first time to the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. So that evolved then when Sandra started bringing people together. We hosted them, we met with them because our home became La Casa de Todos. So it was lent itself to receptions and stuff like that. So when there were people in town, they came to our house and we greeted them, etc. So we connected with Sandra that way, and Sandra invited us to her gatherings as well. And so when she says, I'm going to put this workshop together on a formal basis, will you become part of it? Of course we will support it, etc.
So let me back up a little bit. Who was the director of the Esperanza Center that had a relationship, or who knew your sons?
Yes, Graciela Sanchez, who was then and continues to be one of the founding director of the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, and they had a major cultural dimension to it. They were a ride around presented at Esperanza, et cetera, musicians and the like. So it was already a cultural hub. But my Antonia Castañeda, my spouse, also was appointed very early on to serve on the board of Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And so we had a connection to that center as well. And of course, there were writers and artists who were part of that world as well. And Sandra had been the first literary director of the Guadalupe Cultural Center years before.
So how much earlier did you see Sandra read in San Diego?
No, my first connection with Sandra was when I was in Claremont.
And that
Claremont. Was already the 1980s.
Okay. Let's see. Do you remember the first workshop that you attended with Macondo?
Yes, I do. I believe it was a workshop that I hosted at Trinity University, campus of Trinity University, where we are right now. I believe I hosted it for 2 years here. I may be wrong about that. It may have been only 1 year. But I also participated in another workshop that we held at Sandra's home and the property she joined there. And I was a baby instructor, a mini instructor, and very uncomfortable in that role. But we hosted, essentially what we did is those of us that have been part of that initial workshops which were held at home, I think the most formal one was the one held here at Trinity University. My colleagues and I, they're part of that, hosted the other people and introduced them to the world of Macondo and to San Antonio, etc. But I think probably the first time we participated would have been 1996, myself in the workshop, but formally as a host in 1997.
As a board member, I know that we're at Trinity because there's a memorandum of understanding. Was the initial relationship with Macondo in 1997 grounded in a memorandum of understanding, or was it more informal?
It was more informal. I had a powerful advantage at that moment, which my successor and the extraordinary Norma Cantu has built on. And that is my charge from the president was he wanted Trinity to have a major presence in the Latino community of San Antonio, Texas, and he wanted an Hispanic presence on the campus of Trinity University. And so I had license. And one of the licenses I exercised was to bring the workshop to the campus. And I had free rein in that regard. I was not charged for using the spaces. I was not obligated in any way. Could use this space as we saw fit.
Maybe you can tell me a little bit about the history of Macondo from that point, because I know that Macondo has been at Our Lady of the Lake, it's been at UTSA, it's been at Texas A&M. Can you tell me a little bit about why Macondo didn't stay here? I don't really know that background. Maybe you might.
I don't know. There are people that you will want to interview at some point to find out about that history. I do know that Sandra realized that her space as accommodating, as lovely as it was, did not have the facility to be able to do what she wanted to do. And she had connections with these various institutions through individuals. And she was able to leverage that. I think the best leverage that she had to date had been before Trinity, was with Texas A&M, where it was for a number of years. There was a moment, and it would be interesting to talk to people who know more about that, former board members, when we tried to have it hosted by the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And we actually almost had a memorandum of agreement. By that time, Macondo had a 501c3 status, foundational status. That fell apart, even though Antonia and I, she had served on the board of directors by that time. I think I was also on the board of directors at that time. I was chairing the board of directors in another moment. But for some reason, that didn't realize. And that's been very unfortunate that it didn't happen then. But it's very fortunate because there it was ready for Norma to say, let's have it here. And to find a very hospitable, at that moment, administration at Trinity University that said yes to it.
Can you tell me a little bit about the development of the Macondo Workshop, because you've been in San Antonio during its ups and downs?
It had multiple dimensions. The most important one, of course, Sandra's vision and mission in the artistic domain, in writers specifically. She had been the director of a literary festival and book festival at the Guadalupe. She'd had that experience. I think you can interview her about that experience. It had its positives and its negatives. I think it caused her to think, I need to do this on my own, independent of any institutional requirements or restrictions. Let's say restrictions. But it was also very difficult because you have to raise your money every year, and you have to organize the facilities, and you have to make arrangements. And when you don't have an institutional infrastructure, it's very hard to do. So she winged it for a number of years, doing that, going back and forth. But I was part of a group that actually worked out of her house, out of her situation. And that was, on the one hand, very pleasurable because it was a little community. There were not many of us, and there were the veterans who had been there a couple of years at best, and had that experience and could share it with the new people. But it was also uncomfortable because people were coming to work with her, not necessarily to have a community. But Sandra wanted a community, and we were very aware of it, and we were very supportive of having that community. So those dynamics were very important in its development. It was also moved along because Sandra gets named a MacArthur Fellow. That gave her the greater visibility and resources, cachet, and leverage. The city had to begin to pay attention to her. And so she was able, through people like me, to go to funders and say, we need some support for this Macondo, for this MacArturo's gathering, which feeds into Macondo, because some of them were writers themselves.
You mentioned something that I want to see if you might tell me a little bit more about. You talked about Sandra's vision and mission for Macondo. What did you perceive that to be?
She wanted two things. She wanted to develop a cadre of Latino writers. But she also knew that the world was larger than Latino experience, that they needed to know about the experiences of other writers with whom she was connected. Not only mainstream writers, but also other minority voices that were occurring at the same time. African American voices, Indian American voices, Southeast Asian voices, and the like. She also had a vision of connectedness to the larger Latino, Latin American world, starting not only with Mexico, but including the rest of Latin America. So she was already connected to major Latin American women writers. They were her dear friends and connection. And by this time, I think she had already met Gabriel Garcia Marquez and been inspired by his efforts to create a literary set of literary connections. So she not only was grounded in the importance of Mexican Americans and Latino writers in the United States, but she wanted to expand it to a greater American writing community, and she wanted to connect it to the larger Latin American, Mexican and Latin American community.
Sandra left San Antonio in 2013. What changes did she leave behind when she left? What impact did she have?
Well, she had already had an extraordinary impact through Macondo, but also particularly through the MacArturos. She didn't just get the money and say, okay, I'm off to write and stuff like that. She created a larger community. I mean, the MacArturos gatherings were extraordinary. The fervor, the cultural and artistic fervor was extraordinary. We were able to bring a lot of people into that thanks to Sandra. It also had, whether intentional or unintentional consequences that I was certainly a part of. In some senses, San Antonio was a backwater artistically and culturally, despite the presence of the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. The artists, for most part, didn't live here. They came to the workshop. They came to the festival. They came to make presentations. They came, particularly the ones originally from here. Sandra coincided with people beginning to come back, not only because of UTSA, okay, but also because Arturo's name had gone around. Arturo hosts people at Trinity University. He's hosted Macondo. He's hosted the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Festival. He's done this, he's done that, and he's brought people together. And now there is a community, and you can come and there will be a community. So John Philip Santos comes back about then. Rolando Briceño and Angel come back about then. And there's people who are here already who are very pleased to become part of that larger world. I don't want to in any way negate their presence and their history, but they were reinforced by people coming in from the outside. And Arturo writing constantly letters, come here, so-and-so, come see so-and-so, come, and there's stuff happening at the Guadalupe, etc. There was pre-internet days when you had to do it by telephone and by mail, stuff like that. So the taco line, the enchilada line.
What does Macondo bring to Trinity University?
Let me tell you that Trinity University, for the past 40 plus years, sought to project itself into the national scene. The president that was appointed in 1980, Ron Calgart, I was blessed to be my friend and my mentor, my patron, shall we say, who brought me to Trinity University, decided to essentially to project Trinity into the national scene. Not his sole initiative, the initiative of his board and his funders. First of all, he announces that he wants the best students in the country to come to Trinity University. So he said, full scholarship to all national merit scholars. He eliminates graduate programs, except for 5 that are master's 50-year programs. So no longer a university, it's a college. He creates a status, a rank called distinguished professors, and hires 20 distinguished professors from across the country to come and give stature to the institution and to the departments. He pulls Trinity out of the 1A division in athletics, moves it into Division 3 or Division 4. I'm not an expert in these matters, but Division 3, and makes it competitive with other institutions around Texas and the South. It joins an association, a Southern Association. And Trinity becomes very competitive, not only in tennis, which is why it was a number in Division 1, but also in basketball, and football, and track, and volleyball, and start winning championships. And boys start coming to this institution. Of course, as we know, women were beginning to become the majority, and there's boys at the institution. A lot of other institutions around, they didn't have men. Had a lot of girls. But here you had athletes coming to compete. And so it became a very attractive institution. He changes it to a 4-year institution. Okay? And you have to reside on campus, which becomes a campus community. So Trinity develops a footprint that it had not had. It was La Colina de los Gringos, the hill where the gringos were. UTSA was developing, but did not have a major footprint. St. Mary's had a footprint, but it was way over there. And Our Lady of the Lake had a historical footprint, but no longer had. And IUW was in the beginning to have a footprint, but didn't have a big footprint. So it was a very visible place, and they had an extraordinary series of lectures, major figures, not only scholars and political figures, but also writers and artists who came to give major lectures. So the auditoriums were always full. They weren't, by the way, for the students. They were not aimed at the students. They were aimed at the larger community. The students had their own spaces, artistic and literary and athletic and scholarly, etc.
And so how does Macondo fit into this environment that is being created?
Well, Macondo had been limping along for a few years, held together by his wonderful board members, such as you, Maria Luisa, moving around, looking for space. When Norma succeeds me, she has the ability, the intellectual capacity, the connections, the wherewithal to say we need to build on what we've had here for many years. And she has a receptive administration. There, for a number of years, there was not a receptive administration. She's lucky when she succeeds me to have a very, very receptive and says yes to her initiatives and has its own initiatives. And she has colleagues on the faculty that are willing to support it. And she's known in the community already because she has had a 10-year run at the University of Texas in San Antonio, where she's done extraordinary things and produced extraordinary things. She has a network that's to die for.
What does the presence of Macondo bring to Trinity University by being here?
The president who appointed me, Ron Calgard, had a vision, as I said. He wanted to have presence of Trinity in the Latino community because he could see down the road far enough that he knew that 40 years hence, the majority of high school graduates were going to be Latinos, and that was going to be his pool of talent. And he put in place then people that would be able to realize that in part. So the administration that Norma comes into understands that very well and says, okay, let us build on what we already have. And what we already had was extraordinary because we had something called MAS, Mexico, the Americas, and Spain. I tried to make it Greater Mexico, GMAS, but that my colleagues didn't go for that. And we had monies from the late Carlos Alvarez to get that going. And Carlos Alvarez liked so much what we did here at Trinity that he endowed it. So there was money to have this extraordinary program that is inclusive. It's not just Mexican Americans or Latinos. Anybody can be part of MAS. If you're doing something having to do with Mexico, including Greater Mexico, the US, the Americas, and Spain. And so Norma is able to say, here's something that connects Trinity with the world, a larger world, and works perfectly well here.
What makes Macondo different from other workshops?
Since I don't know other workshops very well, I will only say what makes Macondo different is that it's organic. It's organic. It grows from the ground. It's Sandra and people that she infected and who stayed with Macondo during all these years. We're alumni of Macondo, but she can activate her alumni base anytime she wants to, and we respond. So in those early days when things were troubled, Olivia would pick up the phone and say, Arturo, Antonia, I need help.
So do you think that the organic process is the essence that builds the community?
Yes, because who kept the Macondo alive during this dry spell? The board. The board kept it alive. And the board being able to tap into the alumni and say, we need help. Open the door for us. Give us a hand.
You have been a witness to so many organizations that try to broaden the American vision.
Or shall we say, our inclusion in that larger vision.
Yeah. How does Macondo fit into that? Or how would you evaluate how Macondo is doing in this landscape?
I would say that it is, number one, the longest lived writers' workshop, that if not expressly Latino in its focus, is significantly focused on Latinos and the promotion of Latino writers. I would say that its reach is extraordinary because it's not just limited to the United States. I would say that it's significant because the writers that have come through and out of Macondo continue to say this was an important part of my development and the development of my part. And finally, Macondo has created an international audience, right? A set of readers that go beyond the Mexican-American or Latino borders.
What do you think are some of the biggest publishing challenges for Latino writers?
I'm not knowledgeable about these matters, but I am sensitive to them. I know what has happened. Let me say that we are a resourceful community. I'm talking about the Mexican-American community, now a larger Latino community. We started out creating our own venues because we didn't have venues. We started creating our own publications because we didn't have publications. We mimeographed our own stuff and distribute ourselves because we didn't have distributing houses. So in a moment when there's fewer publishing houses, when they're more difficult to distribute your materials, we will learn how to do. We will invent ways of doing it ourselves.
Give me a moment here. I'm trying to think through what it is that we've covered and where we're going with this. What advice do you have for Macondo to continue its presence in the literary landscape?
I don't pretend to know about that world very much because my world is very different. But I would say I would offer a different kind of response to a different question, and that is the way that Macondo is going to persist is if it continues to engage younger writers, newer writers, young people, and connecting them with more experienced writers. And Sandra can get those older and experienced writers to come. She has convoking power to the nth degree. She can bring people together. It's not something many people have. It is a gift. It is a talent. It is an ability. Sandra has it. The young people will come if they think that it is a space that's going to be useful to them, that they will learn from. The older people will come if they have a sense that what they're doing is valuable. And who will affirm that is Sandra and the young people that learn from her.
If I see you as an institution, you've navigated a lot of changes and left behind a presence that, in this instance, Norma Cantú was able to, take up the ball and run with. So you have a lot of experience in navigating this. What brought you there?
I think it's something I've thought about it, trying to write about it. I had a lot of privilege. Privilege is very relative. My privilege was male, son of educated parents, professionals, who were bilingual and bicultural, I'm very pleased and proud to do it, who valued education, who took great pride in their standing in their community, but also felt very strongly that needed to contribute to it, who had an extraordinary ethos coming out of their Protestant backgrounds that they passed on to me. I had to be responsible. That was most important. I had to be responsible. I had to be engaged. I had to be involved. I had to look out for people that were not as advantaged as I was. By virtue of the community I lived in, my role models certainly went beyond my mom and my dad. My role models were principally political figures. My parents were in contact, and in my case of my mother, on first name basis with governors, with senators, with congressmen. Certainly they called her by her first name. She was very respectful as congressman and senator and governor, but they when they talked to her, they talked Gaby. My father also had a connection with a professional world that went beyond me. So I was very comfortable moving in that world. I think I learned to read social text long before I learned to read literary texts. When I was a toddler in that courthouse, because I spent a great deal of time in the courthouse because my mother was working, I knew who was important and who was not very quickly on. I read that text very, very quickly. So I was immersed in institutional life very early, and I knew how that world worked. So when I went into the church, I learned how that worked. When I went to university, I learned how that worked. I won't say I was comfortable, that I moved freely, but I certainly understood how it worked. And in time, I came to feel very comfortable because I became an officer in that world. And I served on boards, and I saw how boards worked, and I figured out how to work with those boards. So when I come to Trinity, I already have a great deal of institutional capital. And I have lots of visibility and credibility in the higher education world, and of course in my Latino world, because of the positions I've held, because of the things that I've done, which we haven't touched on very much, but they're there. They gave me standing. When I come here, it was just not, Ron's appointed a Mexican. Ron's Mexican. No, there was something that went beyond there that they couldn't, that they said, this guy, he's earned his chops elsewhere. He knows he can move in this world.
That phrase, institutional capital, you worked to acquire it, you used it to build things.
Yes.
How do you transition away from the institutions such that they don't collapse when you're not there?
Yes. I have. That's a very good question, and it touches deeply. Because I created institutions over the course of my life. They've not necessarily survived. But I've also helped bolster institutions when they were on the verge of collapse. Helped. And I've seen some of my peers create institutions that were sustained because they stayed with them.
But none of us are immortal.
None of us are immortal, but some of us are there for the long haul. Others of us say, this is not what I do on a long-term basis. I do this and then I move on. So I'm one of the move-on type. But in the process, I've created things. Let me tell you, for example, serendipity played a great role in my life. It just happened to be at the right place at the right time. Now, just luck doesn't cover it all. You have to be prepared to take advantage of that serendipity. You have to have the capacity to move forward. I get appointed just by sheer serendipity to run the Sport Foundation Graduate Fellowship Program, which produces in its totality the most significant, maybe not the most largest, but the most significant cadre of Latino, Puerto Rican, and Mexican American academics to date. Okay. The larger world is of academics is produced by programs by the U.S. government because of all the grants and all that. But this is a coherent, cohesive group. Other foundations had programs, but they were smaller. This one was very exciting. I used that base to create the National Chicano Council for Higher Education because I realized that not only are graduate students isolated in their institutions, and I went in and I would have meetings and gather them together at the various institutions. They didn't know each other. The guy in philosophy didn't know the guy in biology. The guy in chemistry didn't know the guy in geology. So doing that. I realized that the same thing held for academics. There was no national community of Chicano academics. By founding that organization, I brought them together. I introduced them to each other at meetings. I used my institutional capital to go and get money so that I could help those young people that I had moved through a PhD program to gain tenure by helping them to produce a manuscript, getting a fellowship so that they could take time off and produce a manuscript. Created a writing and dissertation and manuscript completion program so when they were stuck with trying to write it up, they could gather together away from family, away from children, away from duties, and just work on that. So you use your capital to create even more capital. And you keep doing it. Now, Enche, she's gone, didn't survive, okay? But it did magnificent work while it did. The Tomás Rivera Center, the first institute for policy studies on Latino issues ever, named after the late Tomás Rivera because he was one of the creators, but he died before it came to visit. It didn't survive. It didn't survive because I left it. No, it didn't survive because the person and the board that succeeded me didn't allow it to survive. But while I had it, it thrived. And it did things that had not happened before, which is connected all that intellectual talent we had developed with the people that needed that information and that knowledge to do it. And it created a buzz around the issue that it was about discourse because we were perceived as a community that had problems and they were based on family and culture. And we were able to take them on and say, this is not about family and culture. This whole shtick about Latinos not voting because of their culture, BS. In New Mexico, 100% of eligible voters registered to vote and 104% vote because even the dead vote in New Mexico. So don't give us that. And don't give us that about Latinos are not interested in education, because we can show you studies that say the Latinos are way beyond any other community in the hopes, the aspirations for the children. Now, in the expectations, that's different because they know the institution is not serving them. And so that's what we have to take it on. So I used that institutional capital to do that. Did I stay with it? No, because I was not a political scientist. My background was literature. I wasn't even a distinguished literature professor. My distinctions were coming elsewhere. And this was a lovely place for me to have a local presence, a local praxis a life, and where I could teach a generation along young people that would go on to do all kinds of things, not just be academics. So my students have become doctors and lawyers and philanthropists and writers and the like. So I continued to acquire capital, and I've tried to do it around an institutional basis.
Do you have one of your baby institutions or organizations that has been near and dear to your heart throughout?
Anything having to do with what I call the development of our intellectual resources is near and dear to me. So when anybody organizes any new type of organization that brings together Latino academics, those are dear to me because I've been very central to the development of that intellectual capital, not only in the academic arena that is professors and the like, but also in scholarships, in talent identification, in talent promotion. So when I joined the board, because I knew about this organization and had advised it from early on, excellence in education, I said, I fit here. I know what this is all about. This is what I've been involved in. This has not been a field where I've been integral to, but I know what the issues are. And I was, I think, a good contribution to that organization. When I get pulled into the Guadalupe because it's in trouble and it needs rescuing, I had the intellectual capital to be able to deal with it.
Are you still active with, have any of these organizations followed you throughout a lifetime or throughout your professional life that you're still active in?
No, not per se. I think individuals come to me and say, I need some help. Give me your thoughts. What would you do under these circumstances? I have picked and chosen the issues that I'm concerned with. For example, right now, I'm putting together people and I'm sending out a large call to action to deal with 3 issues: detention and deportation. Okay, the elimination of the spaces that we created over the last 50 years for Latinos, cultural spaces, educational spaces, artistic spaces, political spaces. And third, the challenge to our civic status, to our citizenship, to the rights and benefits. But right now, focused on detention and deportation, because that's the most compelling movement. And I have a call out nationwide. It's called On the Responsibility of Latino Academics, Artists, Cultural Workers, and Educators, that they have to engage. There's no cavalry that's going to come to our rescue. We need to do it ourselves. And so I'm doing it locally as well, bringing together educators and artists and academics. Say, okay, what are we going to do about what's happening here in San Antonio? And then if we can be a lesson, make it contagious and have it move to Austin and to Houston and to Dallas and to El Paso.
What does being responsible in engagement look like to you?
It means educating people and engaging them. Saying, this issue needs your attention. You need to figure out how to engage with it. During the Chicano movement, we had artists doing posters and cartoons, and we had artists putting together plays that called attention to issues, etc. We had people who didn't have credentials doing things that were necessary and important to do. Our dear Luis Valdez leaves the academic world and goes and joins the farm worker movement. We need people doing that and say, okay, gotta do this. Gotta do this. I have two mantras that I'm using these days. One is, of course, Noam Chomsky on the responsibility of intellectuals, which is to challenge lies. And the other one is Martin Luther King. And I'm going to have to think about here for a moment. Is this I'm going to have to modify it here, baby. The non-engagement of good people is worse than the brutality of bad people. There's a better word, but I'm not coming up with it right now. So good people have to get engaged. They can't say, I don't know how to do that. I don't understand. I have nothing to contribute. You have to say, you have to find what it is that you can contribute.
We've covered a lot about your career, your engagement with Macondo. Have I left some gaps?
Lots and lots of gaps, but
Is there one that stands out that we should pursue?
No, I don't think so. I think the focus here should be on Macondo. Mm-hmm. We just happen to be here at the right moment. But beyond that, Sandra reached out to us, and it lent itself to what was my hope for my life in San Antonio, that I would have a local praxis. And he gave me a local praxis immediately. But a praxis that was not strictly local. It went beyond. Okay, and it morphed into other things, and it connected me with the artistic community, who welcomed us and included us, because San Antonio, our friend Tomas Ibarra Frausto has told us, are very closed communities, or set of communities, and to be sure it is. Because all Latino communities are essentially built around families, and we didn't have family here, but the artistic family took us in, made it part of us. And then we created our own family.
Is your wife Antonia from?
She's a Tejana who left at age 4. So she came back to reclaim her Tejana identity and has done it extraordinarily well.
Where did she go to?
The Yakima Valley, where there were Mexican Americans who came to harvest the crops every year, but their family settled out. They stayed there. So she and her siblings grew up in the Yakima Valley.
Where were they from in South Texas?
Crystal City, in the valley. Piedras Negras, in the lower valley as well.
Okay. Well, I think that we've probably covered everything that I can think of at the moment. I'm sure that there's many more conversations you and I could have. But unless you have anything else to add, I'd like to thank you.
I would like to say that Sandra created Macondo but the board, the various boards, kept it alive. I think we need to honor those board members that kept it alive during those hard years. Because let us remember that it had a 501c3 status, very important, not easy to get, and that went by the wayside, but that didn't deter the board members from keeping it going, and they kept it going, and here, 30 years later, it's alive and now has an institutional base. So bravo to all those board members.
Thank you. I think about Macondo as a homeland for writers, and it's nice to think of Trinity providing a physical homeland.
Yes, yeah, exactly. There's been some lovely publicity about it too, so I'm very pleased. Somebody got the word, and they started publicizing. Not been very easy to get Trinity University to publicize anything Latino.
At home, I was raised by my parents, my grandparents, my tias and tios. And I sometimes think of the board as the tias and tios of Macondo. And we're just part of that community, trying to keep the kid from getting hurt.
That's right. Keeping things together, keeping them going. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for making Trinity the home for the first time.
Well, it had a home here initially, and it opened the doors.
Thank you for bringing Macondo along.
Well, for supporting it over the years, yeah.
And thank you for being one of the intellectual elders of the Mexican-American community in the United States.
Because there are people that passed on were my intellectual elders. I am now one of them. At age 86, I'm now one of the elders.
Bueno, Don Arturo, con todo amor, thank you.
Thank you.